Good morning and welcome back to the reading of God's Word. This week we are reading in Deuteronomy. We will start in chapter 12 and we'll be reading throughout the rest of the book, and we'll finish up this week in Deuteronomy. Very busy book, just like in the past. We have not going to slow down for a while. Of course, the Deuteronomy is the second law giving. Brother Tim has probably already explained that to you, and it is on the plains of Moab. These will be the last words of Moses as he gives instruction to Israel. And so as we look forward and for today and these next couple of days here, we've got chapters 12 through 18. Basically what we're going to see in this video is God's instruction through Moses to Israel for their relationship with him. As soon as we move out of this video to the next one, it more has to do with human relationships with each other. If we were to take sort of a thought there would be, love your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This would be what we're going to talk about today. And then on the next one would be to love your neighbor as yourself. And if there was one word that you could use about that next one, it would be respect. So we're going to look at today where we are. We begin in chapter 12, and right away we get the instructions, verses 2 through 4, instructions to destroy Canaan. And this is to destroy all the people in Canaan. This is not to leave any man, woman, or child alive. Why is that? It's because they have their idol worship. And what is a fear of God for Israel is that Israel will adopt these idols, and so he wants them to be destroyed completely, clean the land. In this we see where God will select a place for his place of worship. He will eventually find a place for the tabernacle, which would be in Jerusalem later on, but it's far more not about the tabernacle or the temple, but it is more about the Ark of the Covenant. It is the mercy seat. This is where God's presence is, and he will then select a place where they can come to worship him. Notice in verses 16 and 23, he makes reference here not to eat meat with the blood. There's some instruction about food. We'll get into that in chapter 14, but for now we move back to chapter 13. And this is about false prophets. And the Lord is testing you. Verse 3, the Lord is testing you about not following the guidance of false prophets. Well, if we fast forward over to chapter 18, they're going to say, how shall we know if it's a false prophet? And we'll find out that the Spirit will tell them. They will know if they're receiving false prophecies or not. And so the Lord is testing you. In verse 5, it says, anyone who does that, anyone who gives a false testimony, false prophecy, or encourages idol worship will be put to death. Again, we see that it doesn't matter who it is. It can be your own mother, your father, your children, whoever. If they do anything or say anything to say, let us follow other idols or other gods, they are to be put to death. He will not have anything to do with that. And even in verses 12 through 18, even cities, a whole city will be destroyed if it adopts idol worship. So God's not playing when it comes to false prophets and idol worship. In chapter 14, again, we go back to the food. Verses 1 through 23 indicate what meat they can eat. Well, obviously, they can't eat it with the blood. But he gives further instruction about anything that chews the cud and splits the hoof. If you want to narrow all this down for the short version of this, is anything that's a grazing herd that does not eat meat. No carnivorous animals are to be eaten. Those animals eat other meat. So that's a basic rule of thumb. God gives instruction for that. It's just mostly the herd animals. If you get a chance, though, later on, look at Acts chapter 10, verses 9 through 23, and you see where Peter is confronted. He sees the vision 3 times of a sheep coming down out of heaven, and it has all sorts of animals on it, and God tells him to kill Peter and eat, and Peter said, no, I will not defile myself. But this has very little to do with animals. So when we get that far and read into that, it's not so much about the animals here. What this is about is God is calling Peter to witness to the Gentiles. In other words, they felt the Gentiles were unclean, but God is telling Peter then, no, these are my people as well. So when we get that far, that's just another thought here as we get down to the animal and what you can eat. And finally, in chapter 14, verses 22 through 29, we have a procedure of tithing. It's the time of the tithing, what to tithe, and not to neglect the Levites who have no inheritance. So the tithing goes to the Levites. That's their inheritance, which comes to them by the grace of God. And in chapter 15, the Sabbath year. The Sabbath year is every seventh year. It is basically a reset year where everything is forgiven. Slaves, the Hebrew slaves, now not slaves of enemy nations, but Hebrew slaves are set free. All the debt of the Hebrews are forgiven, and everything goes back the way it was. Later we will see that a command not to move land boundaries as well. So the issue there is about resetting everything. Do not, you can't hold on to it. There's a lot of discussion coming up about that. We get into, if we fast forward, we'll see, we don't have time for it now, but we'll see where there is that want to, or that greed to take more than what was theirs. So anyway, it is the Sabbath year. It's every seventh year. And additionally, when we get to the exile, the 70 years of exile, that has a relationship with this Sabbath year. So we get there, we will probably discuss that. Then we move to chapter 16, the festivals. And you've already seen this in the book of Leviticus. It's the Passover, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Booths, the unleavened bread. All these festivals that they are to have, these are joyous times. It is the Passover and unleavened bread. All this has to do with the exile or the exodus out of Egypt. And then we have Feast of Booths and the unleavened bread. Those things that they should be having a time of worship and thanksgiving, and that's what these feasts are about. Then we move over into chapter 17. Basically, just further instructions. Has to do with the sacrifices. An unblemished animal, you cannot just offer anything. Idol worship again. Okay, so verses 2 through 7, more again about the idol worship that he is very strict on. And verse 6, witnesses of two or more. In other words, one person can't go against another person and say, he did that, so kill him. No, it has to be on witnesses of two or more. This is where we get basically our judicial system, and it has to have overwhelming evidence of somebody's guilt or innocence. And then in verses 8 through 13, basically cases of adjudication where judges or the priest are judging between people. Now here we come into another section in chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. This is interesting because God gives direction of what to do when they say we want a king over us. And this is almost like a death wish to the nation. He's saying that when there's a king, when they have a king, there's certain limitations on that king. And later on, as we read through it, we'll find out that Solomon is actually the king that abuses that more than any of the other kings. But that's something in the future here. But as far as almost a death wish, they will say, we want a king like all the nations around me. So I would send you right now to see 1 Samuel chapter 8 and especially in verse 7. They have rejected me from being king over you. He said, do listen to the voice of what they say, for they have not rejected me, or rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over you. This is going to cause them a lot of problems down the road. So that set of verses 14 through 20 is a pretty key set of verses for their future. And then finally in chapter 18, verses 1 through 8, we get more instruction here for the Levitical priests. some more of their instructions. False diviners, and again, anyone who perverts God's law or encourages idol worship. Again, we go back to chapter 13. They are to be put to death, and do not pay attention to them. There's going to be a tough time when you do. Verse 15 through 19, he said, God tells Moses, he says, I am going to raise up another prophet like you. This is an absolute this is just an encouragement. This is a compliment beyond compliments to Moses, because it is a direct reference to Christ. And Moses was the greatest prophet before Christ, and no one ever will be like him until Christ. And then when Christ comes, of course, he will overshadow everything. And then in 20 through 22, the prophets, again, when they make their prophecies, how will we know that they're telling us the truth? Well, the Spirit of God will let them know that the prophecies are coming true, and there is an evidence of the prophecy. But by and large, you can fast forward to 1 John chapter 4, and it says, test the spirits. We are told to test the spirits, and in our world, if it is if the prophecies are, the spirits are telling us something that directly relates to Christ and points us that way, well, then we can believe the prophets. But if it does not, we are not to believe them. So there's a lot here. This has to do more, again, with, in these chapters, to our relationship with God. And in the next video, we will look at relationships with each other. So with that, pray that God gives you insight into all of this reading, and may he have mercy and blessings on this reading.